Welcome to Cooking the Books. I'm Frances Cook. Emotions and money are like petrol and fire. Try not to mix them if you can, because it's likely you won't enjoy the result. So while I've loved seeing more people paying attention to their money in the last year, and particularly the fantastic surge in people who are interested in investing, I have found it worrying that emotions are clearly also in the mix. Strategies abound for getting rich quickly. Hyped stocks are spread through online forums, and for every overnight winner, there are 10 losers left in their wake, carrying the can. The reaction to this in some quarters has been for people to warn that the share market is like a casino, and that if you dabble, you should prepare to get burned. Well, that's just not true either. Shares are a proven wealth building strategy. It's just that you do need a strategy as you get started. Getting your emotions under control is part of that strategy for every single one of us, whether that's greed, fear, or FOMO.
News Talk ZB presents Cooking the Books with Frances Cook.
I'm joined now by AUT Senior Lecturer in Finance, Dr. Aisha Scott. Now, to me, there's been a lot of emotion in the market for the last year, probably understandably, but also strikes me as quite dangerous. Let's start at the beginning. How do you think people should be managing their emotions when they're investing?
Well, I think that there's a few things to talk about here. Thank you for having me, by the way. The first rule is emotion shouldn't come into it when you're investing, because ideally, you know that no good decisions get made out of fear. And fear tends to be the primary emotion that I think leads to poor decision making when it comes to finance. You know, at the moment, there's probably a lot more of that going on. We were on this podcast, I feel like at the start, this time last year, talking about not panicking because the markets were going down and COVID and the pandemic was, sort of gaining a little bit of speed. And hopefully everyone listened then and they made a plan. So the best way to keep emotion out of investing is to have a plan that you make when you're not feeling emotional, when you're not feeling panicked. And then you just stick to that plan when you are feeling emotional. The key questions that you need to be asking are, what's your time horizon? What's your personal appetite for risk? If you're not someone who can keep the emotion out of your financial matters, out of your investing, then you probably just need to not look at the daily news cycle for a period of time. The second thing that I do is I tend to invest in line with my values. So whatever that looks like for you, your values are unlikely to change. And over the last year, you've probably got a little bit clearer about what those values are. So for me, this means that before I make any investment decision, I'm asking myself if I agree with what that company or that fund, how they're doing business. And that to me is key. It might be important to you, it might not be. Values is a very personal thing, but between your plan and your values, you don't need to have the emotional side of it.
I think you are so right when you say about fear is a really big one that pushes these bad decisions. I'd also say even sometimes the opposite of greed can make people jump in and do silly things. Any of these kind of raw emotions can push you to do things that in the cold light of day you think, that wasn't my best decision ever. And when you talk about, setting up a plan and having a think about it beforehand, I think that has been one of the biggest things that's been really important for me, at least in this last hectic year, is I already thought, the market goes up, the market goes down, and if it goes down, here's my plan. And even when I knew the market was supposed to go down at times, and then it did go hugely down, it wasn't like it was fun. It was stomach clenching and it was awful, but I knew my plan and it was comforting to just stick with it and not have to think of one in the moment. I do feel like forethought and accepting that this is part of it and making a plan for when it inevitably happens, that's a big part of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think that the sort of second thing, in line with have a plan, is don't be scared to reassess your plan when your circumstances change. So, I mean, the prime example of this is if you are living on reduced income, whether that's, yourself or your partner had their income reduced during the pandemic, whether it's still reduced. I know that my family in Australia are dealing with a different set of challenges because the Australian government is doing things slightly different from the New Zealand government. And I have students here who are dealing with, huge pressure because maybe themselves or their partner or a member of their extended family has been made redundant. And they're having to navigate this sort of, uncertain world. And that has big repercussions for the rest of their lives. Now, it doesn't matter what circumstances look for you right now. If you had a plan, you can check in with that plan in the same way that you would do when something big changes that you have control over. Like, we look at big life events that affect finances, like buying a house, moving in with a partner, maybe having a baby. These things are things that change the financial landscape for you slightly. But if you've already thought through a plan, you can change that plan. Just don't do it in the heat of the moment. The other thing is, if you have a plan and you know what you're going to do if, say, the market goes down or if the market goes up, then you almost get excited about what you want to do. So at the moment, with the market doing fairly random things but generally still going up, I'm kind of getting excited for prices to come down because I know what I will do when prices come down, and I'm kind of almost waiting for that. I'm waiting for the housing market, for instance, to start being a little bit more sensible, and because I know that that's an opportunity for me. So I don't think that we need to be scared about change. We don't need to be excited necessarily in a way that's going to make us jump the gun. But what we do need to do is not be scared to reassess our plan. I'm going to say plan a lot in the next 10 minutes. Brace yourself.
True, right? It is just true. I feel like my one regret from March, April last year is I almost wish I had invested more. I stuck with my usual investing amount. And what stopped me from investing more is that all around me, companies are doing these big layoffs. And it was just such an unknown situation that I was like, I'm just going to keep more cash on hand. The extra money that I could be investing, I'm going to put that into cash savings just to make sure my cash is really high. And that's, I feel, an example of what you say of, tweak the plan, but also not changing it entirely in the heat of the moment, because I did keep investing. I do look back at that though, and I'm like, man, if I had known for sure that my job was going to be fine and I could have put however much extra into shares and stocks at that time, oh, you would have made a killing. But it's hindsight, right? You can't tell the future. You just don't know.
Well, I mean, we're not going to be able to pick the tops, and we're not going to be able to pick the bottoms. The idea here is that we just keep chipping away because a little becomes a lot. And that's why things like time horizon are really important. People that were, in the correct KiwiSaver risk level for them pre-pandemic, those circumstances probably haven't changed unless they have made some decision. Now, you're in charge of your decisions. You can choose a lot of things. That's not to say that some people haven't been thrown a complete curveball with an unexpected redundancy. I think there's a lot of pilots out there who probably thought that they were choosing a really solid job, and at the minute, facing some fairly uncertain financial circumstances. But you can fall back on hopefully some emergency savings. Hopefully there is some government support there. And, hopefully you've been talking to your bank and making sure that you're front footing, any of the uncertainty. When it comes to investing more, it's quite hard at the moment, for me at least personally, to be stockpiling cash because of financial uncertainty, and I want to make sure that my family's still provided for when interest rates are so low. And the stock market is doing much better than that, but again, you need to look at everything, not just how things are right now, but how things might be in 12, 24 months from now, and just do what you feel is going to provide you the most security.
And you mentioned earlier about how things have been acting weird. And I think, there's been a lot of weirdness recently. And I'm always quite wary of anything that's getting a lot of hype and buzz. My personal view on it is by the time you hear about the hype, it's already too late.
Yes.
The most obvious to me is GameStop recently, but we also had Tesla and New Zealand. They had a lot of hype at various points recently. I mean, what do you make of these really hyped stocks?
So, I think we've got they're all hyped. So there's, and you say Tesla, but equally it could be an Amazon, it could be an Uber. There's so many of these kind of, I suppose, almost popular brands that we can see their logo. With Tesla, the story is very much tied up in Elon Musk. And there seems to be two camps of thought. There are the people who think that he is like a thought leader and, a genius who is going to lead Tesla, up and up and up. And then there are people who are saying, look, Tesla's value is all tied up in this one guy who's a little bit erratic. And there doesn't seem to be too much of a middle ground there with Tesla.
Put me in the second camp.
Yeah. So saying that, if Elon called me for some reason, I would have a conversation with him. So it's kind of, it's
so
fraught,
true,
right? It's fraught. Not going to be saying, oh, look, I don't really think that, you're a genius. But Tesla is all tied up in its founder, really. With GameStop, it's a totally different kettle of fish because, people get really excited and hype up brands that they're thinking have some kind of future. With GameStop, the rise had nothing to do with information. It had everything to do with a group of people deciding to buy that stock. Now, regulators will tell you that that is not a good thing because that is actually manipulating the market. And it will be interesting to see over the coming months and years, because these things never happen quickly, but it'll be interesting to see what actually comes out of that and whether there is regulatory change. Because technically, to my eye and my understanding of market manipulation, is that group of investors in GameStop, who were jumping on the forums and who were actively, G'ing up this stock, they were manipulating the market. They were colluding to pump up that share price. Now, that's just not allowed. That's just, and the reason that it isn't allowed is because everyone needs a fair playing field. So the idea of market regulation is that stock prices be allowed to go up and down based on information. There was no information that should have been price sensitive with GameStop. It was just a group of people deciding to buy the stock to increase the share price. Now, their motives in their own mind might have been solid, but it's no different really to a group of insiders engaging in insider trading, which is, I think everyone will agree, is never a good idea.
Mm.
So I think we really need to separate out hype that is based on someone's future expectation of a company and hype that is literally existing only in social media because someone had an idea, they put it on the internet, and it went viral.
Mm.
Um, I think that the exchanges and regulators, and the platform were caught a little bit off guard. I don't think that anyone had seen anything like the, GameStop story before.
Mm.
And so they didn't quite know what to do with it. And I don't think anyone sort of knew how to act quickly enough,
Mm.
to put a stop to it before it got a little bit out of hand.
Yeah, it's interesting, that one, right? Because I look at something like obviously GameStop was driven mostly by Reddit, but there's also a lot that's happening on, I see a lot on Instagram of people saying things that either I look at that and I'm like, "Oh, that's just not true," or it's at the very best slightly dodgy. And so you see things like that all the time. And you've got the FMA here. I've talked to the FMA about it
Mm.
before, and they're worried about it, but they're stuck taking a sort of whack-a-mole approach, because
Yep.
it's hard to track these people down. And if you look at something like Reddit, where it's mostly anonymous and it's these individuals working together, they're not under any sort of cohesive group or company or whatever. I mean, do these regulators, how much power do they have?
I think it is limited, and it's very, very hard to actually prove the motive behind it and the intent.
Mm.
So, you know, were the Reddit users, was it their intention to pump up that stock? What I suspect happened is it was a financial forum where stock tips and I'm investing in this thing and this is doing really well and this is what I think about this. I mean, there is a whole, like, Reddit is one platform. I mean, FinTwit, financial Twitter, is like a whole other ball game,
Yeah.
but it's effectively sharing information. Now, the difference and the danger is that when you get enough people acting on that information, that
Mm.
has real consequences for them. So for every great story that came out of GameStop, the 10-year-old kid that made 5,000% and can now, do this, that, and the other thing. For every awesome story that came out, there's going to be a whole raft of stories where someone sold everything they owned and invested it in GameStop, and now they've lost everything. We
Mm.
saw it with Bitcoin as well, when everyone was investing in Bitcoin. These trends come and go. I think that it's going to be up to the regulators to make sure that they're doing everything they can, not necessarily to whack the moles after the fact, but that they're trying to educate. And I mean, I know that the FMA are, the CFFC is, we've got to try and educate our population so that when they do invest, they know what they're getting into. There are protections in New Zealand that are slightly different from the US, that do protect us kind of inherently. So some of the leverage that we see in the US being available to, everyday sort of unsophisticated investors, some of those mechanisms don't really exist for the everyday Kiwi. And arguably, maybe they should, but on the flip side, in this situation, it's good that that there are some barriers to entry, because it does protect people from reading something on Instagram or reading something on Reddit and then acting on that because some influencer told them to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think your point there about, like, I sat back and watched GameStop, and I'm just going to admit it was entertaining as anything. It was, I
Yeah.
sat back with a bucket of popcorn and went, wow, let's see how this goes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the same time, the part of me that isn't an awful anarchist was watching it and saying, okay, the little guy is making a stand, but also the little guy is going to get burned. because there were individuals jumping in when the stock was at the top, and they were left carrying the can when the inevitable slide downwards began. And it's all fun and games, but unfortunately the little guys get burned too, and that's what I hate to see. I mean, GameStop was obviously hugely hyped. That was a really big hype. Whether or not, as you say, we can count it as a pump and dump, it was definitely hype. And do you ever think there's a case for getting in on hyped stocks, or is it just avoid them?
I don't think it's not necessarily about avoidance, because I think that it's human nature to want to invest in the things that we know. I think about another example that has kind of had a couple of iterations globally, but cannabis stocks.
Mm.
So this is essentially people saying, I have a ideological standpoint that cannabis should be available either for medicinal purposes, or perhaps you think that it should be legalized for recreational use. And this is changing around the world, and regulation is kind of in this state of flux. And so when these things get put on the front page of the newspaper, our recent referendum is a case in point, suddenly people are all looking at cannabis stocks and going, oh, hang on, maybe this is the next big thing. I want to be in at the ground level. I want to look back, counting my millions in 5 years' time, knowing that I invested way back when. And then, of course, something happens, like the referendum doesn't get up, some sort of regulation comes in, there's maybe some kind of inquiry on these things, and suddenly the next big thing isn't the next big thing. So there's risks with jumping on these hyped stocks. That's not to say don't do it. It's just go in with your eyes wide open. Know that if it's on the front page of the newspaper, chances are that you're now riding the momentum. You're not acting on the piece of information that has led to a whole heap of people buying in at the first minute. We assume that markets are overall, efficient, which means that information is being priced into the market all of the time. Momentum exists, and there's nothing wrong with riding the wave, but know that you probably haven't picked the bottom, and you are very unlikely to be able to pick the top. At the moment, markets seem to be, by historical standards, fairly overheated. So there will be a top eventually. No one can guess when that is. Some people will get burnt. I think ultimately, if you're diversified and you're not selling everything to invest in the next big thing, then you're going to be insulated from that, because some stuff has done really, really well when other stuff has gone really, really badly. And hyped stocks are no different. They're not immune to a market cycle.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? I mean, there's this sort of speculative investing where you're getting interested and you think there might be something coming in the future. And then there is stock standard, the type of investing that you do for long-term planning. And I feel like knowing the difference between the two is really important. So in amongst all of the noise, amongst all of the hype, is there a good strategy for individual investors to cut through that and try to invest well, so that, okay, fine, it might be interesting, but also you're making sure that you're doing what you're actually probably intending, which is growing your wealth?
Yep, absolutely. Diversify, and diversify across sort of various things. So we've been talking a lot about stocks today. So you want to be diversified, not just, across different companies. You want to be diversified across different industries. And I think, the best example here is anyone who was invested in an airline has maybe not done so well over the past year. But if you were invested in an airline and then you were invested in, I don't know, something that delivers products to people while they're in quarantine, then they've probably done quite well. So there are businesses that have done quite well anything that was with virtual communication has done quite well. Broadband have all done quite well. So you're spreading out your risk. Now, you can do that within a portfolio of stocks by investing in different companies and different industries. You can invest across geography, so you don't have to feel that you're constrained to just investing in New Zealand. And think about assets outside of stocks as well. So, you can invest in real estate. And we actually have a couple of real estate trusts that are traded on the NZX. So that is effectively something that you can buy and sell. It has the liquidity of a listed company on the exchange, but you're effectively investing in a portfolio of real estate. Now, that's going to be a lot more liquid and give you a lot more flexibility whilst adding to your diversification than going to an auction and buying a villa in Auckland, which is going to tie up a lot of your capital. So just spread the risk out. If you spread the risk out, then over the long term, the risk level that you've decided, be that a higher risk growth strategy that is for the longer term, which is, overall going to do well, regardless of these little blips in the radar. Or if you're looking at a more short-term strategy, then maybe you just have to suck it up and get no interest at the moment on your savings, knowing that it's more important right now for that money for you to conserve that capital. And I think it just comes back to have a plan. If you have a plan and you know what you're going to do when things change, then it's really hard to make poor decisions because you have a plan. Hopefully you have thought about that plan. It comes from an educated place and it's not subject to hype, because it's pretty hard to get emotional about a solid financial plan. Just saying.
So true. And I always come back to, I mean, I came across the core satellite strategy, and I just think it is one of those that is a really good mindset. And the idea of basically something like 80% of your strategy being the bog standard advice of index funds or several different companies, at least, even if you want to do it outside of funds, you're making sure you're across a bunch of different industries in a few different countries, and you're in that really obvious long-term investing strategy that is proven and has worked for decades. And then if you really want, you can have 10 to 20% of it that is your more speculative money, things that you want to take a punt on, things that you believe in for your own values or whatever. It may or may not work. And particularly, I had a few episodes back, we talked about Bitcoin. I'm still not convinced on Bitcoin, but lots of people are, and they believe in it. And that's fine. I feel like as long as if someone put 100% of their money into Bitcoin, I would freak out on their behalf. If you want to put 5% of your portfolio because you believe in it and you think it's the future, I mean, you might be right and you might make so much money out of that. And you also might be wrong, but it's not going to tank your entire financial future. And I feel like that's an important balance to have, right?
Absolutely. I think also people get a little bit intimidated when they think of financial planning, or they have to think of their portfolio. People often, for example, don't think of the assets, like the physical assets that they have, as part of their portfolio. People often don't include, their property in their as one of their investments, because they feel like, well, they have to have a house. But it is all part of one big pot of money that you have. I think the easiest thing to do for someone who just wants to invest for their long-term security is, do the 80%. I mean, it's not unlike budgeting 101, right? You have all your essentials, in the biggest part of your budget to make sure that you have food and shelter. And then you have your money that you can spend on crap, essentially, whatever, takes your fancy. And that's where you have your sort of speculative flutter, your gamble on the next best thing. And I think also, particularly in the current market, and I think over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of pressure for people who are very, very interested in finance to invest directly into companies. And I think that it's okay if you're someone who is a little bit wary of markets to go, right, well, I'm not all that interested in researching, Air New Zealand's fundamentals, I actually don't care. So it's okay to go, well, I like the look of that one. I'm going to put a little bit of money into that one. But the bulk of my investment strategy is actually handled by my KiwiSaver manager, for example, or by another fund manager. Or perhaps I'm going to put the bulk of my money in just the market in an ETF, and that's going to be fine too. I think that there's a lot of pressure to kind of feel like we need to be doing all of the things, but we don't need to be doing all of the things. We just need to do what we enjoy. For some people, my husband, that is really getting down into the weeds of, deep value companies, and taking some risks. That's his hobby. That's cool. But the bulk of our wealth is tied up in other things, and is part of a long-term strategy. The other thing I'd say is when you're making your plan, it can be pretty intimidating to think about like retirement or the big goals. So one of the things that I really, really like to do is think of the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 system of like planning or goal setting. And that is, think of your long-term goal, so your 5 years, then break it down into what you can do in the next 4 months, what you can do in the next 3 weeks, 2 days, and 1 hour. There is always something that you can do right now that will lead you toward the big goal. It might be something as simple as choosing to make a coffee in the office versus going down to the next door cafe. Or it could be something as simple as add check in with KiwiSaver onto your to-do list. There is always something that you can do right now. But that right now doesn't have to be, I'm going to go and buy GameStop, for example. It can be, I'm going to think about putting a little bit more into a direct account, so that I can buy something when I want to.
Oh, 100%. Real words of wisdom there. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Aisha Scott from AUT. Now, if you have questions about this podcast or something else you'd like us to talk about in the future, do get in touch. You can find me on Facebook, Frances Cook Journalist, Twitter, Frances Cook, Instagram, Frances Cook NZ. Just pick your favorites, send me those questions. Let's get them answered in a future podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to Cooking the Books anywhere you find podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And until next time, have a great day.